Close your eyes if you haven't already. Let the day fall away from you now, like sand slipping through open fingers, like the last light of evening dissolving into the western edge of an ancient sea. There is nothing you need to do. There is nowhere you need to be. For the next little while, we are going to drift together through a world that existed long before ours. A world of warm stone and slow water, of oil lamps flickering in vaulted corridors, of quiet footsteps on mosaic floors. Tonight, we are visiting the bathhouses of ancient Rome. Not the grand political dramas you may have heard about, not the rise and fall of emperors or the clash of legions on distant frontiers. No. Tonight is much quieter than that. Tonight, we are interested in the people who kept the water warm. The ones who swept the tiles before dawn. The attendants, the stokers, the oilers, the towel bearers, the unnamed thousands whose daily rhythms kept one of the ancient world's most extraordinary institutions running, day after day, century after century. And from there we will drift. Gently, slowly, as if carried by a current. From Rome to Byzantium, from Byzantium to the quiet cloisters of medieval monasteries, from monasteries to the murmuring coffeehouses of the Ottoman world, and onward still to the caravanserais of the Silk Road and the lamplit reading rooms of ancient Alexandria. Each place connected to the last by a thread so fine you may not even notice it. Each one a small, warm room in the long corridor of human history, where people gathered not to conquer or to fight, but simply to rest, to talk, to be clean, to think, to sleep. So settle in. Let your breathing slow. And let us begin. In the gray hours before sunrise, when the city of Rome was still wrapped in silence, and the stars had not yet fully retreated from the sky, a man named, well, we do not know his name. History did not record it. He was a furnace tender, a fornicator, and his day began in darkness. He would descend into the narrow service tunnels beneath the bathhouse, where the hypocaust system waited for him like a sleeping animal, its belly full of ash from the day before. His job was to feed it, to coax the fire back to life so that by the time the first bathers arrived in the late morning, the floors above would be warm to the touch, and the water in the great bronze basins would steam gently in the cool air. The hypocaust was one of the quiet engineering marvels of the Roman world. Beneath the floors of every significant bathhouse ran a network of low channels and squat brick pillars, the pilli stacks, which held the floor slightly above the ground, creating a hollow space through which hot air could circulate. A furnace at one end of the building would send waves of heated air flowing beneath the floors and up through hollow tiles in the walls, called tubuli, warming the entire structure from below, the way the earth itself is warmed by forces deep beneath its surface. The furnace tender understood none of this in the language of engineering. He understood it in the language of his body, the weight of the wood, the color of the flame, the sound the fire made when it was drawing well. He knew that olive wood burned clean and long, that pine crackled and spat and left a resinous residue in the flue, that damp wood meant smoke, and smoke meant complaints from the bathers above, and complaints from the bathers above meant trouble from the manager, and trouble from the manager meant less food and fewer coins at the end of the week. So he worked carefully, and he worked alone. The furnace room was hot, of course stifling, even, and the air was thick with the smell of burning wood and old ash. He would rake out the previous day's embers, stack fresh logs in the arched mouth of the furnace, and use a long iron poker to arrange them just so. Then he would wait. Listen. Feel the draft. And when the fire caught, he would close the iron door partway and let the heat begin its slow journey through the labyrinth beneath the tiles. Above him, the bathhouse was slowly waking. Other attendants were arriving now, entering through a side door that opened onto a narrow alley behind the main building. These were the caravanserais, the cloakroom attendants, who would spend the day guarding the belongings of bathers in the apoditerium, the changing room. They carried their own small oil lamps, and the light threw long, wavering shadows on the painted walls as they moved through the still empty halls, checking the wooden cubbies and benches, sweeping the floor, arranging the stacks of clean linen that had been delivered the evening before. The apoditerium was a surprisingly intimate space. It was here that bathers would strip, senators and freedmen alike, soldiers and merchants, old men and young boys, and entrust their clothing, their purses, their sandals to the care of the caravanserais. Theft was a constant worry. The Roman poet Catullus complained about it, and so did Martial, and so did half the satirists of the 1st century. The caravanserais were expected to be vigilant, and many of them were, but the temptation was real, and the penalties for stealing were severe. Still, most days passed without incident. The caravanserais sat on low stools near the entrance, watching the cubbies, nodding to regulars, exchanging a few words with the bathers who lingered to chat. The changing room was one of the most social spaces in the bathhouse, a place where conversations began that would continue through the tepidarium, the warm room, and the caldarium, the hot room, and sometimes all the way to the frigidarium, the cold plunge, where men gasped and laughed and slapped their chests before dressing and heading back into the noise of the city. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. The bathers have not yet arrived. The sun is only now beginning to touch the rooftops of the insula blocks across the street, and the bathhouse is still empty, still quiet, still being prepared. In the great vaulted hall of the tepidarium, another attendant is at work. He is checking the water levels in the basins, testing the temperature with the back of his hand, adjusting the bronze taps that controlled the flow from the aqueduct-fed cisterns on the roof. His name, too, is lost. But his work was essential. Without him, the bathhouse was just a building. With him, it became something else, a living system, a place of warmth and care, a place where the city came to breathe. And so the morning continued. Slowly, methodically, without hurry. The oil lamps were trimmed and lit. The floors were mopped with vinegar water. The bronze fittings were polished until they caught the light. The strigils, those curved metal scrapers used to clean oil and sweat from the skin, were laid out in neat rows on marble shelves. The jars of olive oil were brought up from the storeroom and placed beside the massage tables in the unctorium, the anointing room, where later in the day the unctors, the oilers, would rub warm oil into the shoulders and backs of tired men who had spent the morning arguing in the forum or hauling goods up from the Tiber docks. Everything had its place. Everything had its rhythm. And in that rhythm, there was a kind of peace, a peace that we, from our distant century, can still almost feel if we listen closely enough. By midday, the bathhouse was fully alive. The great wooden doors had been opened to the public, sometimes for free, sometimes for a coin so small it was barely worth minting, and the halls were filling with the sound of footsteps, splashing water, murmured conversations, and the occasional sharp crack of a massage being administered with rather more enthusiasm than the recipient had expected. Among the most important figures in this daily theater were the unctors and the lamplit, the oilers and the masseurs. These were skilled workers, sometimes enslaved, sometimes freedmen, sometimes even specialists who had trained in the Greek tradition of athletic bodywork. Their role was to anoint the bathers with olive oil before exercise or bathing, and then, afterward, to scrape the oil away with a strigil, removing with it the sweat and grime and dead skin that had accumulated over the course of the day. It was a surprisingly intimate process. The bather would stand or lie on a stone bench in the unctorium, and the unctor would pour a thin stream of oil into his palm, warm it between his hands, and then begin to work it into the skin, starting at the shoulders, moving down the arms, across the chest, along the back, down the legs. The oil was usually plain olive oil, though wealthier patrons might bring their own scented blends. Rose-infused oil from Egypt, saffron oil from Cilicia, nard oil from the foothills of the Himalayas, carried thousands of miles along trade routes that stretched from the banks of the Ganges to the wharves of Ostia. The lamplit, the masseurs, worked with a deeper touch. They kneaded muscles, stretched joints, pressed their thumbs into the knotted tissue along the spine. Some of them were renowned for their skill, and wealthy Romans would pay handsomely for a private session. The physician Galen, who served as doctor to the gladiators of Pergamon before coming to Rome, wrote extensively about the therapeutic value of massage, distinguishing between firm rubbing, which he said was stimulating, and gentle rubbing, which he said was relaxing, and very slow rubbing, which he said could put a patient to sleep. Very slow rubbing, which could put a patient to sleep. Imagine that. Imagine lying on a warm stone bench, in a room heated from below, with the sound of water trickling somewhere nearby and the scent of olive oil in the air, and feeling a pair of skilled hands working the tension out of your shoulders with long, slow, unhurried strokes. It is not so different, really, from what we seek when we close our eyes at night and ask the world to be quiet for a while. The strigil work came after the oiling, and it was its own small ritual. The curved blade, usually bronze, sometimes iron, occasionally silver for the very wealthy, was drawn across the skin in long, firm strokes, collecting a paste of oil, sweat, and dead skin cells that the Romans called gloios. This substance was, remarkably, collected and sold. The gloios of famous athletes was prized as a kind of medicine or charm, and even the ordinary scrapings from a public bathhouse were sometimes gathered and used in folk remedies for joint pain and bruising. The attendants who performed this work did so for hours at a time, day after day, in rooms that were warm and humid, and filled with the low hum of human bodies at rest. It was physical labor, certainly, but it was also a kind of meditation, a repetitive, rhythmic practice that required attention and care but not thought, not worry, not ambition. You scraped, you wiped the blade, you scraped again. You felt the contour of a shoulder blade beneath the oil. You heard the bather sigh. You moved on. And around you the bathhouse breathed. Water flowed through its veins. Heat rose through its bones. People came and went, but the building itself remained, steady and warm, like a body that never quite falls asleep. Beyond the unctorium, the bathers would drift into the main bathing halls. The tepidarium was first, the warm room, where the air was mild, and the light came in through high windows set with panes of translucent stone or thick, greenish glass. Here, bathers would sit on heated benches and talk, or simply sit in silence, letting the warmth soak into their skin. The attendants in the tepidarium were mostly water carriers and towel bearers, moving quietly among the bathers, refilling basins, offering fresh linen, clearing away the used towels that accumulated in damp piles by the door. Then came the caldarium, the hot room, where the air was thick with steam, and the marble walls were almost too hot to touch. This was the heart of the bathhouse, the place where the heat was most intense, where the water in the great central basin, the labrum, was almost scalding, and where bathers would pour ladles of hot water over their heads and let it run down their bodies in sheets. The attendants here worked in conditions that would strike us as punishing. The heat was relentless. The humidity made it hard to breathe. But they moved through it with practiced ease, adjusting the water temperature, clearing the drains, mopping the floors to prevent slipping, and occasionally helping an older bather who had stayed too long and grown dizzy from the heat. And finally, the frigidarium, the cold room, the shock, the awakening. Here, a plunge pool of cold water waited, fed directly from the aqueduct, and bathers would lower themselves in with a gasp and a shudder, feeling every nerve in their body fire at once. The attendants in the frigidarium had the easiest job in some ways. The cold room required less maintenance, less cleaning, less fussing, but also the least comfortable, for they stood all day in a room where the temperature was deliberately kept low, wearing thin tunics, their feet bare on cold stone. In every room, in every corridor, in every corner of the bathhouse, there was someone working. Someone invisible. Someone essential. And the bathers, for the most part, barely noticed them at all. As the afternoon deepened and the light outside the high windows shifted from gold to amber to a soft, dusty rose, the bathhouse entered its quietest hours. The crowds thinned. The conversations grew softer. The splashing in the pools became less frequent, and the spaces between sounds grew longer, wider, like the spaces between breaths when you are almost asleep. This was the time when the attendants began their evening work. The oil lamps, hundreds of them in some of the larger establishments, had to be checked, refilled, and trimmed. The lamps were small clay vessels, most of them, shaped like shallow boats, with a single wick protruding from a narrow spout. They burned olive oil, the same oil that was used for anointing, and they cast a light that was warm and unsteady, a light that made shadows dance on the painted walls and turned the marble columns into something soft and golden and dreamlike. The lamp tender moved through the bathhouse with a small jug of oil and a pair of bronze tweezers for adjusting the wicks. He worked methodically, room by room, and as he went, the building seemed to settle around him, the way a house settles at the end of a long day, creaking gently, releasing the heat it had stored, breathing out. The furnace tender, far below, was banking the fire now, reducing it to a slow, steady burn that would keep the floors warm through the evening without wasting fuel. Tomorrow morning, he would be back before dawn to stoke it again. But for now, the fire was low, and the heat was gentle, and the building was at rest. In the apoditarium, the last bathers were dressing, wrapping themselves in their togas or their simple tunics, fastening their sandals, collecting their belongings from the caravanserais. Some of them lingered. The bathhouse in the evening had a particular quality, a stillness, a warmth, a sense of enclosure that made people reluctant to leave. Outside, the streets of Rome were darkening, and the noise of the city was changing from the daytime clamor of carts and vendors and children to the nighttime murmur of taverns and footsteps, and the occasional bark of a dog in a distant alley. Inside, the bathhouse was a sanctuary, a womb of warm stone. The cleaning crews arrived as the last bathers left. These were often the lowest-ranked workers in the entire operation, enslaved people, many of them, or freedmen with few other options. Their job was to scrub the pools, drain and refill the basins, sweep the floors, clear the drains of hair and oil and the small, unmentionable detritus of hundreds of human bodies. It was hard work, and it was done in the half-light of the oil lamps, in rooms that were still warm but cooling, in an atmosphere that smelled of damp stone and stale olive oil, and the faint, lingering sweetness of whatever perfumed oils the wealthier patrons had brought with them. They scrubbed with stiff-bristled brushes and buckets of water mixed with vinegar or lye. They got down on their hands and knees and worked the grout between the mosaic tiles, where black mold liked to grow in the warm, wet joints. They polished the bronze fittings. They collected the used strigils and carried them to the back room, where they would be scraped clean and oiled and laid out again in the morning. They gathered the damp towels and linens and bundled them into baskets for the fullones, the launderers, who would wash them in great stone vats using a mixture of water, wood ash, and famously, almost unbelievably, aged human urine, which contained ammonia and was one of the most effective cleaning agents available in the ancient world. It is a strange detail, perhaps, but it is also a human one. The ancient world was not a museum. It was not a collection of marble statues standing in clean, white rooms. It was a place where people sweated and ate and relieved themselves, and washed their clothes with whatever worked, and went to bed tired and woke up in the dark, and did it all again. And the bathhouse was at the center of that life, not because it was grand, though many of them were, but because it was necessary. It was where the body was cared for, where the skin was cleaned, where the muscles were eased, where the day was washed away. By the time the cleaning crews finished their work, the bathhouse was dark and empty and quiet. The oil lamps had been extinguished, all except one or two near the entrance, where a night watchman sat on a stool with a heavy stick across his knees, guarding against the thieves and vagrants who sometimes tried to break in after hours to sleep in the warm rooms or steal the bronze fittings. The watchman was often an old soldier, or a retired gladiator, or simply a large man with a strong arm and a tolerance for long, silent nights. He sat and he watched and he listened. And the bathhouse cooled around him, ticking and creaking as the stone contracted, releasing the last of the day's heat into the night air. Somewhere beneath his feet, the furnace had gone out. Somewhere above his head, the stars were turning. And now we drift. Gently, softly, like a boat untethered from its mooring, carried by a current we can feel but cannot see. We drift eastward across the Adriatic, across the Aegean, to the city that was once called Byzantium, and then Constantinople, and then Istanbul, a city that sat at the hinge of the world, where Europe met Asia and the waters of the Black Sea mingled with the waters of the Mediterranean. The bathhouse tradition did not die with Rome. It simply changed shape. In the eastern half of the Roman Empire, the empire that would come to be called Byzantine, the public bath remained a central feature of urban life for centuries after the last Western emperor had been deposed and the aqueducts of Rome had begun to crumble. The great baths of Constantinople, the baths of Zeuxippos, the baths of Arcadius, the countless smaller neighborhood baths scattered through the city's 14 regions, continued to operate much as their Roman predecessors had, with furnace tenders and oilers and capsaria and cleaning crews, though the names changed and the customs shifted, and the theological arguments that now echoed through the steam-filled halls would have baffled a bathhouse attendant from the time of Trajan. The Byzantines were Christians, of course, and their relationship with the body was more complicated than that of the pagan Romans. There were church fathers who warned against excessive bathing, who saw the bathhouse as a place of temptation and vanity, who urged the faithful to mortify the flesh rather than pamper it. But the bathhouse endured because the body endured, because people still sweated and ached and needed to be clean, and because the social function of the bath, as a meeting place, a place of negotiation, a place of community, was too deeply woven into the fabric of Mediterranean life to be easily unpicked. The attendants of the Byzantine baths were, in many ways, indistinguishable from their Roman predecessors. They tended the fires. They carried the water. They scrubbed the tiles. They sat in the changing rooms and watched over the bathers' clothes. But there were differences, too. The Byzantine bathhouse was often smaller than its Roman counterpart, more intimate, more local. It was a neighborhood institution, not a vast imperial complex. The attendants knew their regulars by name. They knew who preferred the water very hot and who preferred it mild. They knew who came to bathe and who came to talk and who came simply to sit in the warm room and doze. The bathhouse in Constantinople was also a place where news traveled. In a city without newspapers, without radio, without any of the technologies of mass communication that we take for granted, the bathhouse served as a kind of informal information exchange. Attendants overheard everything: political gossip, commercial intelligence, personal scandals, theological disputes, And they passed it on, quietly, discreetly, in the way that people who spend their days in the company of others always do. The bathhouse attendant was, in this sense, one of the best informed people in the city, though no one ever thought to ask him what he knew. And the city itself was changing around the bathhouse, century by century, in ways so slow they were almost invisible. The great aqueduct of Valens, which brought water to Constantinople from the forests of Thrace, was damaged and repaired and damaged again. The population rose and fell. The neighborhoods shifted. Fires swept through the wooden districts and were rebuilt. Earthquakes toppled domes and cracked cisterns. And through it all, the bathhouse endured, a small, warm constant in a city of constant change. The attendants of these later centuries would have recognized the work immediately if they had been transported back to the bathhouses of Augustan Rome. The tools were the same. The rhythms were the same. The heat, the water, the oil, the stone, all the same. What changed was the world around them, the language spoken in the streets, the God worshipped in the churches, the coins jingling in the bathers' purses. But inside the bathhouse, time moved more slowly. Inside the bathhouse, the essential human acts, washing, resting, warming, talking, being still, remained unchanged. As they remain unchanged today, as they will remain unchanged for as long as there are bodies that grow tired and minds that need quieting. There was a particular hour in the Byzantine bathhouse, late afternoon, when the light through the clerestory windows turned from white to amber, when the pace of everything seemed to slow. The attendants called it, if they called it anything at all, the quiet hour. The morning rush was over. The midday crowds had thinned. The remaining bathers were the ones who had nowhere urgent to be. Retired officials, elderly widows in the women's section, a few scholars from the university who came to the baths to think as much as to wash, letting the heat loosen not only their muscles but their ideas. During this hour, the attendants had time to rest. They would sit on the stone benches in the service corridors, eating bread and olives and drinking water from the ceramic jugs that were kept in a cool alcove near the cistern. They talked in low voices about the things that working people have always talked about: their families, their aches, the cost of bread, the behavior of a difficult patron, the rumor that the bath master was thinking of raising fees. Their conversations were ordinary, unremarkable, and for that very reason, they were never recorded, never preserved, never considered worthy of mention in the chronicles and histories that have come down to us. And yet those conversations were the sound of civilization itself, not the grand, trumpet-blaring civilization of imperial triumphs and ecumenical councils, but the small, daily civilization of people living together, working together, sharing food and gossip and the warmth of a common fire. The bathhouse was a place where this civilization happened, naturally and without effort, in the steam and the stillness. And so we drift again, forward now, through the centuries, watching the bathhouse change and endure, change and endure. The Byzantine Empire gives way to the Ottoman. The crosses on the church domes are replaced by crescents. The language in the streets shifts from Greek to Turkish. And the bathhouse, the hammam, now continues in a new form with new rituals but the same essential purpose: warmth, cleanliness, rest, community. But before we arrive at the hammam, let us pause for a moment in another place entirely. Let us drift westward again and backward to the quiet stone cloisters of a medieval European monastery, where a different kind of bathing ritual was practiced. One shaped not by the pleasures of the body, but by the disciplines of the soul. The monastic life was a life of rhythm. The day was divided by the canonical hours: matins before dawn, lauds at first light, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers in the evening, compline at night, and every activity from prayer to work to eating to sleeping was fitted into this structure like stones in an arch, each one supporting the others, the whole thing held together by the weight of faith and habit. Bathing in this world was not a luxury. It was a necessity, grudgingly permitted, carefully regulated, and hedged about with rules designed to prevent it from becoming a source of pleasure. The rule of Saint Benedict, which governed the daily life of thousands of monasteries across Europe from the 6th century onward, allowed monks to bathe when they were ill, but discouraged frequent bathing for the healthy. The body, in the Benedictine view, was a vessel for the soul, and while it needed to be maintained, it was not to be indulged. And yet, the monasteries had their bathhouses. They were small, simple affairs: a heated room, a tub or a basin, a supply of water carried by hand from the well or the stream, but they existed because even the most ascetic monk needed from time to wash. The attendant in a monastic bathhouse was usually a fellow monk, assigned to the task by the abbot as part of the rotating schedule of duties that kept the monastery running. He heated the water over a wood fire, carried it in buckets to the bathing room, and ensured that the monk being bathed was not lingering too long or taking too much pleasure in the warmth. It was a world of extraordinary discipline and extraordinary quietness. The monastic bathhouse had none of the social bustle of its Roman counterpart. There was no gossip, no laughter, no splashing. The monk bathed in silence, or near silence, with only the sound of water and the crackle of the fire, and perhaps the distant chanting of his brothers in the chapel drifting through the stone walls. And yet, even here in this austere setting, the essential act was the same. Water on skin, warmth on tired muscles, the simple, animal comfort of being clean. The monk who stepped out of the bath and into the cool air of the cloister, wrapping himself in a rough wool robe, felt the same relief, the same lightness, that a Roman senator had felt stepping out of the caldarium 8 centuries earlier. The context was different. The theology was different. The architecture was different. But the body was the same. The monastery itself was a kind of bathhouse, in a way, a place of cleansing, of purification, of renewal. The monks washed their souls with prayer as they washed their bodies with water. And the rhythm of their days, the steady, unvarying cycle of work and worship, silence and song, waking and sleeping, had something in common with the rhythm of the bathhouse attendant's day. The fire to be tended, the water to be heated, the floors to be swept, the lamps to be lit, and then, at last, the stillness of night. In some monasteries, particularly the larger Cistercian and Cluniac houses, the waterworks were remarkably sophisticated. Channels of running water were directed through the monastery complex, feeding the kitchen, the infirmary, the laundry, and the lavatorium, the washing place where monks rinsed their hands before meals. These water channels were maintained by monks who had been trained in the practical arts of hydraulics and plumbing, skills that had been passed down, in many cases, from Roman sources, preserved in the libraries and scriptoria of the very monasteries where they were now applied. And so, even in the cloister, the ghost of Rome lingered. The water still flowed. The stones were still warm. The hands that tended the fire were different hands, belonging to men with different names and different prayers, but the fire itself was the same fire, the same patient, necessary, endlessly renewed flame that had burned beneath the bathhouses of the Caesars and would burn, in time, beneath the hamams of the sultans. And now we arrive at last at the hammam. The Turkish bath. The inheritor of the Roman tradition, filtered through centuries of Byzantine practice and shaped by the rituals of Islam, which placed a profound emphasis on cleanliness, not merely as a social courtesy, but as a spiritual obligation, a preparation for prayer, a way of approaching the divine. The Ottoman hammam was, in many ways, the most refined expression of the bathhouse tradition that had begun in Rome more than 1,000 years earlier. It retained the basic structure, the changing room, the warm room, the hot room, the cold room, but it transformed these spaces into something new, something uniquely beautiful. The domes of the hammam were pierced with small, star-shaped openings that admitted shafts of light, so that the interior was filled with a soft, celestial glow, as if the steam itself were luminous. The marble platforms where bathers lay were heated from below, just as the Roman floors had been, and the attendants, the telak, moved through the steam like quiet, purposeful shadows. The telak was a figure of considerable skill and cultural importance. He was not merely a servant. He was a practitioner of a craft that had been refined over generations. His job was to bathe the patron, to scrub the skin with a coarse cloth mitt called a keys, to lather the body with olive oil soap worked into a cloud of foam, to rinse, to massage, to stretch, to crack the joints, and finally to wrap the patron in clean, warm towels and lead him to the cooling room, where tea or sherbet would be waiting. The rhythm of the hammam was slower than the rhythm of the Roman bath. There was less movement, less noise, less coming and going. The bather lay still on the warm marble, surrendering to the hands of the telak, and the telak worked with a kind of meditative concentration that was, in its own way, a form of devotion. The movements were precise, unhurried, almost ceremonial. The scrubbing of the skin was not merely a cleaning. It was a renewal, a shedding, a symbolic rebirth. The rolls of dead skin that came away under the keys were proof that the body was always changing, always growing, always letting go of what it no longer needed. The hammam was also, like its Roman ancestor, a profoundly social space. It was where business was discussed, where marriages were arranged, where friendships were formed and maintained. For women especially, the hammam was one of the few public spaces where they could gather freely, away from the restrictions of the household. The women's hammam, or the women's hours in baths that served both sexes at different times, was a world unto itself, filled with conversation, music, the sharing of food and gossip and advice. The attendants in the women's hammam were women themselves, skilled in the same arts of scrubbing and massage, and they served as confidants, counselors, and matchmakers as well as bath attendants. And still, beneath all the social ritual, the essential act remained. Water, warmth, the care of the body, the quieting of the mind. In the hammam, as in the Roman bath, as in the monastic lavatorium, the body was attended to with patience and skill, and the soul, whether it knew it or not, was attended to as well. And now we drift once more. Away from the cities, away from the domes and minarets, out into the vast, open spaces of Central Asia, where the Silk Road stretched like a thread of spider silk across deserts and mountain passes and high, windswept plateaus. Here, in the emptiness between cities, the traveler found another kind of resting place, the caravanserai. A caravanserai was a roadside inn, built to shelter the caravans of merchants, pilgrims, and travelers who moved along the great trade routes that connected China to the Mediterranean. They were built at intervals of roughly a day's journey, 20 to 30 miles apart, so that a traveler could always be sure of reaching shelter before nightfall. They were sturdy, functional buildings, usually constructed of stone or brick, with a large central courtyard where the camels and donkeys and horses could be fed and watered, and a ring of small, cell-like rooms around the perimeter where the travelers slept. Many caravanserais also had a bathhouse. A small one, nothing like the grand thermae of Rome or the elegant hammams of Istanbul, but a bathhouse nonetheless. A room with a furnace, a basin of heated water, a place where a traveler who had spent the day riding through dust and heat could wash the road from his skin and sit for a while in the warmth before eating and sleeping. The attendant at a caravanserai bathhouse was often the caretaker of the entire establishment, a single man or a small family who lived on the premises and maintained the building year-round, even during the long, empty months when the trade routes fell quiet and no caravans came. He tended the furnace, swept the courtyard, repaired the walls, and greeted the travelers when they arrived at dusk, their camels groaning and their faces caked with dust, looking for nothing more in the world than a warm room and a basin of clean water. The caravanserai was a place of extraordinary diversity. On any given night, the courtyard might hold merchants from Samarkand and Bukhara, Chinese silk traders, Indian spice dealers, Persian scholars, Arab geographers, Nestorian Christian monks, Buddhist pilgrims, and Turkic horsemen, all of them sharing the same fire, the same food, the same bathwater. The attendant served them all. He did not ask about their religions or their politics or their reasons for traveling. He gave them shelter and water and warmth, and in the morning they went on their way, and he swept the courtyard and waited for the next caravan. There is something deeply peaceful about this image, a single building, standing alone in the vastness of the steppe, offering rest to anyone who came. No questions asked. No loyalties demanded. Just shelter and warmth and the quiet company of strangers. The caravanserai was one of the most generous institutions in human history, and it was maintained, for the most part, by endowments, charitable foundations, called waqf in Arabic, established by wealthy patrons who believed that providing shelter to travelers was an act of piety, a way of earning merit in the eyes of God. And so the attendant tended his fire, and the travelers rested, and the stars turned overhead, and the road stretched on in both directions, east and west, carrying silk and spices and stories and songs and ideas and diseases and prayers and dreams from one end of the known world to the other. And in the morning the travelers rose and loaded their camels and moved on. And the attendants swept the courtyard and waited. But in the evenings, those long, lantern-lit evenings when the caravanserai was full and the courtyard rang with the sounds of a dozen different languages, there was a particular magic to the place. The cooking fires would be lit, and the smell of roasting lamb and flatbread and cumin and cardamom would drift through the arched corridors. Travelers would spread their carpets and sit cross-legged, sharing food with strangers, trading not only goods but stories of cities they had seen, of storms they had weathered, of bandits they had outrun or bribed or talked their way past. The attendant heard all these stories. Over the years, he accumulated a mental library of the world, assembled from fragments, contradictory and incomplete, but richer in some ways than anything contained in the scrolls of any formal library. And when the stories were done, and the fires had burned low, and the travelers had wrapped themselves in their blankets and laid their heads on their saddlebags, the caravanserai fell quiet. The camels shifted and sighed in the courtyard. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. The wind moved across the steppe, carrying with it the scent of dry grass and dust, and the faintest trace of rain from mountains too far away to see. And the attendant banked his fire and checked the gate, and lay down in his small room by the entrance, and slept the deep, dreamless sleep of a person whose work is done. And now one last drift. One last gentle turn of the current, carrying us to a place that is not a bathhouse at all, and yet shares something essential with every bathhouse we have visited tonight: a quietness, a warmth, a sense of care and preservation. We are in a library, an ancient library, perhaps the great library of Alexandria, though that famous institution is more myth than memory now, its destruction a story told so many times and in so many ways that the truth of it has dissolved, like salt in water, leaving only a faint taste of loss. Or perhaps we are in one of the smaller, less famous libraries of the ancient world, the Library of Pergamon, or the library at Ephesus, or one of the private libraries that wealthy Romans kept in their villas, where scrolls of papyrus and parchment were stored in cylindrical cases on wooden shelves, labeled with small tags, and tended by enslaved librarians whose names, like the names of the bathhouse attendants, have been almost entirely forgotten. The library attendant's work was not unlike the work of the bathhouse attendant, in its rhythms if not its substance. He arrived early. He checked the rooms. He ensured that the scrolls were properly stored, that the cases were sealed against damp and insects, that the reading tables were clean and the lamps were filled. He unrolled scrolls for readers and rolled them back up again when they were finished. He repaired torn edges with strips of linen and paste. He copied damaged texts, letter by letter, onto fresh papyrus, preserving words that had been written decades or centuries earlier by hands long since turned to dust. The library was warm in winter, thanks to a small brazier, and cool in summer, thanks to thick stone walls and high, narrow windows. The light inside was soft and golden, the same lamplight that filled the bathhouses, olive oil burning in clay vessels, casting shadows that moved like living things on the walls. The air smelled of old papyrus and ink and beeswax, and faintly, of the cedar oil that was used to protect the scrolls from bookworms. And the silence. The silence in an ancient library was not the enforced, watchful silence of a modern library, policed by stern-faced librarians with disapproving looks. It was a natural silence, the silence of concentration, of people absorbed in what they were reading, following the argument of a philosopher or the narrative of a historian or the instructions of a cook or the observations of an astronomer, their lips moving slightly as they read. For reading in the ancient world was almost always done aloud, or at least in a murmur, the words shaped by the mouth as well as the mind. The attendant moved through this silence like a shadow, replacing scrolls, trimming wicks, bringing fresh ink to a scholar who had been writing for hours and whose ink pot had gone dry. He was invisible, as the bathhouse attendant was invisible. He was essential, as the bathhouse attendant was essential. And the work he did, the preservation of knowledge, the care of fragile things, the maintenance of a space where people could come to think and learn and be still, was a kind of bathing too. A bathing of the mind. A cleansing of the spirit. A warming of the intellect against the cold of ignorance and forgetting. And so the library endured as the bathhouse endured, as the monastery endured, as the caravanserai endured, not because it was grand or powerful or politically important, but because it answered a need that is as old as humanity itself. The need for a quiet place, a warm place, a place where the noise of the world falls away and something gentler takes its place. And now at last we are still. The lamps are low. The fire is banked. The water is cooling in the basins, and the last echoes of the day have faded into silence. We have drifted a long way tonight, from the furnace rooms of Rome to the steam-filled domes of the Ottoman hammam, from the quiet cloisters of medieval monasteries to the star-shaped caravanserais of the Silk Road, from the warm stones of ancient bathhouses to the cool, papyrus-scented rooms of forgotten libraries. And in every place we visited, we found the same thing: people tending to the small, essential work of care. Heating water, sweeping floors, trimming lamps, keeping the fire alive. These are the acts that history forgets, but they are the acts that made history possible. Without the furnace tender, there was no warm bath. Without the warm bath, there was no bathhouse. Without the bathhouse, there was no place for the city to gather, to talk, to rest, to be human together. The unnamed attendants of the ancient world held civilization in their hands, not the grand, marble-columned civilization of the textbooks, but the small, daily, breathing civilization of bodies that need warmth, and skin that needs cleaning, and minds that need quieting. So let the fire go out now. Let the water cool. Let the lamps dim. You have drifted far enough tonight, and wherever you are, whatever your day has held, you are here now, in a quiet place, in a warm place, in a place where nothing is asked of you and nothing is expected. Rest well. The attendants have done their work. The bathhouse is closed, and the long, gentle night is waiting for you. Good night.